the enemies of free institutions, founded on an equality of rights and of rank, and a general diffusion of property and intelligence, being accustomed to urge as an objection to such a system, that it, in a great measure, precludes the progress and perfection of literature and the fine arts. It is our design to subject this assertion to the test of reason and experience. Each of these go to establish the fact that the enjoyment of freedom is highly favorable to the dignity as well as the intelligence of human character, and if such is the result of liberty in all other departments of intellectual occupation, it seems little less than an absurdity to presume that literature and the fine arts should be the solitary exceptions to this great general rule. We believe this theory to be entirely unfounded, and as devoid of truth as it is derogatory to the character of freedom. We never wish to see the higher virtues and manlier pursuits, nor the primitive energies of a free and vigorous people, sacrificed to the exclusive cultivation of literature and the fine arts. We never wish to see the time when the United States shall, in the midst of corruption and effeminacy, seek refuge from the sense of degradation, in the vanity of producing the best poets, painters, sculptors, and musicians, or warming themselves amid the darkness which envelops the present in the sunshine of their past glories. In our eyes, the composer of an opera, the prima donna, and the prima donna should never come in competition with those who perform great services to the state, nor does it appear to be estimating merit by a just standard to place Paganini before Washington, or the sculptor who chisels a hero above the hero himself. Those virtues and talents which are indispensable to the government and safety of nations, the conduct and preservation of their useful institutions, and the general welfare of mankind are, in our opinion, a far more rational and salutary source of national pride than the mere accomplishments which, though they adorn society, constitute neither the foundation nor superstructure of true glory or substantial happiness. The elegant and ornamental should never take precedence of the useful arts, as they have done in Italy, where at this moment they are far behind the United States in all those domestic comforts and conveniences which form so large a portion of the stock of human happiness. Still, a competent skill in literature and the fine arts is a just source of national pride, and every government, as well as every people, should foster them with a judicious liberality. We do not mean that they should give more for a tune on the fiddle or an air at the opera than they are willing to pay for objects of real utility, nor lavish on a successful actor or buffoon rewards and honors which they deny to the meritorious statesman, the successful defender of his country, or the powerful assertor of her fame and freedom. Whenever this false estimate becomes the ruling principle of nations and their sovereigns, it has always been found that the ruin, or at least degradation, of those nations was close at hand. Effeminate pursuits succeeded the more manly exercises of the intellect or the body. Genius became the handmaid of luxury, instead of the parent of patriotism and virtue, and prostituted itself to gain the notice of kings, princes, and nobility, instead of laboring to deserve the love and gratitude of the people. Literature ought ever to have precedence over the fine arts, since while it amuses, it enlightens. It is the medium of a great portion of our knowledge, the casket in which is deposited our moral and religious codes, our mentor and instructor. It makes knowledge not only immortal, but increases its vigor and richness from age to age. Like our Mother Earth, it produces, fosters, and preserves at the same time. The fine arts, on the contrary, are rather sources of refined amusement than of salutary instruction. None of that knowledge necessary to the improvement of mankind, the conduct of life, or the attainment of happiness can be obtained by a contemplation of the Venus de Medici or the Apollo Belvedere. Nor can it be said with truth that a man or woman either is better or wiser for having studied them to intensity. The same may be said of the productions of the fine arts in general. They afford a rich and innocent source of gratification. They come in aid of human enjoyments and are so far the auxiliaries of virtue that they frequently afford resources for passing that leisure which might otherwise be spent in a manner less innocent. On the whole, however, experience seems to have demonstrated that consummate culture in the fine arts has always hitherto been one of the last stages in the progress of nations, and has ever rapidly followed, if it has not preceded, degeneracy and decay. Be this as it may, we cannot withhold the expression of our pleasure at seeing the steady progress daily making in this country in literature and the fine arts, because we believe that there is no intrinsic incompatibility between the virtues necessary to preserve liberty and the pure and rational refinements of a wholesome, natural, manly taste. We have, moreover, long cherished a conviction that the enjoyment of a rational freedom, such as we of the United States are blessed with, associated with a general liberal diffusion of property and intelligence, which always carry with them an improvement in taste, was far more favorable to the cultivation and independence of literature and the fine arts than all the patronage kings, princes, and nobles ever bestowed upon them, from their birth to their maturity and decay. This is the position we shall attempt to establish in the ensuing discussion first, on the ground of general principles and general results. Secondly, on the authority of history and experience. It seems to us, in the first place, degrading literature and the fine arts below the most ordinary handicraft trades, by presuming that they cannot subsist but in a state of abject dependence on a particular individual, who must not only be rich but noble. It is making menials and paupers of their professors, and placing them on a level with the tenants of the kitchen, who look up with abject submission to the smile and the favor of him who gives them wages in return for labor and obedience. All other pursuits depend on the general wants, habits, and tastes of the people at large for patronage, and nothing is necessary to their success but the general diffusion of those wants, habits, and tastes to produce a liberal remuneration for the exercise of talents and industry, unaccompanied by any feeling of dependence or degradation whatever. The artist or the literary man who receives a pension from a king, or who exists on the bounty of a great man, must almost necessarily be restricted in the employment of his genius. The painter or sculptor is in all probability directed in the choice of his subject, not by his own taste, but that of his patron. And the literary dependent must not soar beyond etiquette, nor grasp at forbidden fruit. His wings are clipped, his fancy restrained, and his reason manacled by the fear of displeasing the master who feeds and clothes him. Voltaire, who had ample personal experience on this point, during the boasted reign of Louis XIV, the Mecenas of modern times, in speaking of the appointment of Addison to the post of Secretary of State, says, with equal truth and severity, had he been in France, he would have been elected a member of one of the academies, and by the credit of some women, he might have obtained a pension of 1,200 livres, or else been imprisoned in the Bastille, upon pretense that in his tragedy of Cato, strokes had been discovered which glanced at some persons as power. Voltaire was himself a striking example of the miseries of royal patronage, which is frequently but another name for royal persecution. He sought refuge from the latter in the protection of the great Frederick of Prussia, under whose alternate smiles and frowns he languished a few years, and at length retired to Ferney, where alone he could enjoy the sweets of independence. It seems to us that mankind are too prone to continue to receive, as a sort of inheritance, and to repeat without discrimination, those maxims which may have once been true, but which have become obsolete and inapplicable by the almost imperceptible yet wonder-working influence of time and the great changes it produces. At the period in which literature and the arts awakened from the long sleep of ages, in Europe, the feudal system prevailed everywhere. All property and all power was in the hands of the king, the church, and the nobility. And as a direct inevitable consequence, it was from these alone that the arts, not indispensable to the existence of man in a social state, could receive encouragement or expect support. Artists, of course, look to this source exclusively, and hence we find them in a great degree under the special patronage of monarchs, popes, princes, cardinals, and nobility. It was the same with literary men, who could find no purchasers for their works among a people who could not read, and of course had no inclination to buy, and who, if they had, possessed not the means of paying for them. The only exception to this state of things, and we look upon it as decisive in favor of our theory, was the city of Florence, then a democracy. It was in this free city that literature and the fine arts first arose from out the obscurity of the Dark Ages. It is from a democratic community, shining like a solitary star in the dark regions of feudal despotism, that we can distinctly trace the progress of literature and the arts in modern times. It was there that the first Greek scholars opened their schools. It was there that Dante, the great original of modern poetry, strung his lyre. It was there that painting and sculpture first threw off the fetters of a barbarous taste, and such was the vast influence of its literature, that it wrested from Columbus the glory of giving his name to a new world which he had discovered. And we will ask, who were the first and greatest patrons of those arts and that literature? Not monarchs or princes, but a family of illustrious merchants, holding their temporary authority by virtue of the choice of the people, and deriving their wealth not from their labors, but from the pursuits of an enlightened commerce. Nor were they alone the patrons of the arts, since, among the earliest and finest specimens of sculpture in that distinguished city, are a series of statues voluntarily contributed for its embellishment by the companies of artists and laborers. One of these is by Michelangelo, and others by the most distinguished of his contemporaries. Do not these facts, founded on historical authority, sufficiently prove that the institutions of monarchy and aristocracy, and the consequent degradation of a large portion of mankind, are not essential to the most flourishing state of literature and the arts? Do they not indicate, with the finger of truth, that these embellishments of life need not necessarily be purchased at the price of slavery and dependence? The city of Florence will be found on consulting the great historian Machiavel, who, though a consistent Republican, has been oddly metamorphosed into an advocate of tyranny, to have been at the very time she gave the impulse and the law to the literature and arts of Europe, as much a democracy as Athens herself, when she stood in the same commanding attitude at the head of the Grecian state, we may say at the head of the world. If such examples are not more common in history, it is because, with few exceptions, mankind have, in all ages and nations, been trodden underfoot by the armed hoof of despotic power. The general principle is unquestionably in favor of the doctrine that it is the nature of free institutions to expand and invigorate the faculties of the human mind. Out of a state of absolute barbarism, liberty cannot exist without a general, though not an equal distribution of property and intelligence. It presupposes what is indispensable to its being, a people free from actual poverty and its consequent wants, possessing a spirit which resists all innovation on their rights, and a degree of culture which elevates them above the common level of abject ignorance. Such a people, imbued, as they always will be, more or less, with the rudiments of taste, a desire for mental gratifications, and a capacity for improvement, may and will do, in their collective numbers, all, and more than all, that kings, popes, princes, cardinals, and nobility have done, or ever will do, for literature and the arts. And this too without subjecting artists and literary men to a degrading dependence on the favor or caprice of one single man. Appealing to a wealthy and enlightened community, nay, to the whole civilized world, their genius has not only a noble incitement of a far higher character than that of pleasing one single man, but a wider scope for its exercise, free from all apprehension of the loss of bread or favor, by expatiating in the boundless space of the universe. They need not fear to incur banishment or imprisonment by exploring the depths of philosophy for hidden truths, or vindicating the rights of the human race at the expense of those who inflict on them nothing but wrongs. They have no reason to apprehend the fate of Galileo, Grotius, and hundreds of illustrious victims to the persecutions of jealous power or bigoted intolerance. For they address themselves to a free people who neither start at shadows, nor imagine they see in the diffusion of knowledge the downfall of religion and civil government. On general principles, which furnish the only just grounds for general truths, we maintain, then, that it is a solecism to presume that equal rights and the general diffusion of property and intelligence can operate injuriously on the exercise of the human intellect in any department, pursuit, or profession whatsoever. Such a theory is unphilosophical in principle. It is at war with the inflexible union of cause and effect, and it is contradicted by the long experience of mankind, which has clearly demonstrated that free institutions make free minds, and that it would be just as true to assert that the physical powers of man are strengthened by chains, as that his intellectual faculties are expanded by being prohibited from exercise. For the purpose of maintaining our doctrine on the basis of individual experience, we will now proceed to compare what the royal and noble patrons have done in former times with what the people are doing now in other quarters. When the faction of the nobles gained the ascendancy in Florence over the democracy, they exiled Dante and persecuted Michelangelo. Tasso was patronized by the Duke of Ferrara, and after having his heart broken and his reason shattered by the capricious tyranny of his noble patron, died a beggar and a madman. Michelangelo, having established a fame which made it an honor for princes to employ him, was invited to Rome and patronized by Leo X, the Mecenas of the Purple. Let us see to what this patronage led. The artist, says his biographer, had received instructions to construct a monument for Julius II, and he was anxious to complete the work when he was called from it by the Pope, Leo X, who insisted upon his going to Florence to build the facade of the Church of St. Lorenzo. He would have remonstrated, but was forced to submit, and while at Carrara procuring the marble, he received a letter from Leo, ordering him to go to the quarries of Pietrasanta for that purpose. Michelangelo complied, but reported that the marble there was of bad quality, and that there was no way of conveying it to Florence without making a road over mountains and marshes to the sea. The Pope, however, persisted, and commanded him to proceed, the consequence of which was that the talents of this great man were buried in those mountains during the whole pontificate of Leo, in raising stone out of a quarry and making a road. Those who desire to know more of the patronage of popes and kings have only to consult the biography of that great but eccentric artist, Benvenuto Cellini. Annibale Carracci was patronized by the Cardinal Farnese, who demonstrated his veneration for antiquity by pulling down the Colosseum to get materials for his palace. The prize he received for those splendid paintings, now forming the richest ornaments of that palace, and which occupied him 10 years, was 500 crowns, which does not amount to 1/2 of what the porter now every year receives from thousands of visitors who flock from all parts of the world to admire these splendid productions of art. But he had the honor of being patronized by a prince cardinal. Domenichino was also patronized by a cardinal, who paid him about £12 for the Communion of St. Jerome, which is now worth as many thousands. There is a fine picture of the flight into Egypt by Andrea del Sarto, in which Joseph is represented on a sack of corn. The following fact will account for this circumstance. The picture was painted for a munificent patron who paid him with a sack of corn, to commemorate which he introduced it as we have described. Titian, who stands at the head of his art, after being patronized by Alfonso, Duke of Ferrara, and the Senate of Venice, continued in such a state of poverty that his friend Peter Aretino, the famous satirist, who kept kings and popes equally in fear in order to relieve him, recommended him to Charles V, Emperor of Germany, who took him under his patronage. The greatest honor ever paid to this eminent artist, in the opinion of his biographer, was the emperor stooping down one day to pick up his pencil. But Correggio, the graceful, the touching, the inimitable Correggio, nobody can tell the time of his birth or the place where he was born. His parents were poor, and his education was neglected. Yet, by a persevering study in the school of nature alone, he arose to a degree of excellence which none have ever exceeded. But he continued poor all his life, and the manner of his death while it presents one of the most affecting pictures on record, peculiarly illustrates our theory. It was employed to paint the Assumption of the Virgin in the cupola of the cathedral at Parma, a task which he performed in a manner that still calls forth the admiration of all true judges of the art. His work was found fault with by his patron, probably as an excuse for beating down the price, which was reduced to 1/2. This was paid in copper money, which the poor artist was obliged to carry home on his shoulders to his indigent family, a distance of 7 or 8 miles. The weight of his burthen, the heat of the weather, and the depression of his spirits threw him into a fever, which, at the expiration of 3 days, put a period to his life. After this, let us hear no more of the necessity of monopolies of wealth and rank to the existence and encouragement of the fine arts. We could, without the labor of much research, easily swell this catalogue to an extent that might surprise the reader, who has been accustomed to consider the patronage of the great as synonymous with wealth and honors. We could quote hundreds of distinguished names in literature and the arts, who were condemned to poverty and degradation by the patronage of kings, princes, and nobles, or left to perish in neglect and obscurity by their want of taste and munificence. The whole history of literature and the arts shows distinctly that there is scarcely an instance in which the unfortunate protégés of aristocracy did not pay, by a life of flattery and servitude, for the miserable pittance of ostentatious parsimony, and the still more degrading condescensions of lordly pride. These patrons of the arts were seldom, if ever, the first to discover and encourage unprotected genius. They waited until the voice of fame had proclaimed their triumphs, and it was not until then that they condescended to reward their talents with a niggardly patronage, and to admit them into their society, when they could derive honors from the association far greater than they could bestow. From a pretty careful examination of the subject, we are satisfied it was not to the patronage of the great that literature and the fine arts were indebted for their revival, or their ultimate excellence, during the period in which they flourished in Italy. There must, therefore, have been other causes operating to produce this effect, and they will probably be found in the natural eagerness and vigor with which the human intellect pursues a novel and attractive object in a new field and fruitful soil not yet exhausted by cultivation. This field presented itself on the revival of literature and the arts in Europe, and it cannot be wondered at that men of genius cultivated it with all their newly awakened energies, and with a success which has left to posterity no greater glory than that of equaling them. The wide distinction of ranks, and the awe with which all those who were not noble looked up toward those that were, may have come in aid of other excitements to the cultivation of literature and the arts. Setting aside courage and skill in war, there were no other means by which the barrier between the noble and the peasant could be overleaped than excellence in literature and the fine arts. This procured admission into the charmed circle of nobility and attracted the notice of princes. It raised the low-born peasant to an intercourse with those to whom he was accustomed to look up with reverence and fear as a superior order of beings, and though experience generally proved that such an association only brought mortification and indignity to the ambitious scholar or artist, still, it was not the less an object of ardent solicitude, or a less powerful stimulant to exertion. When Charles V picked up the pencil of Titian and presented it to him, saying, "It is fit that Caesar should wait on Titian," there can be no doubt the knowledge of such a condescension inspired equal envy and emulation among his rivals and successors. So far, then, the approbation of the great undoubtedly contributed to animate the exertions of genius. But is there not in a free country a nobler stimulus to the ambition of a generous spirit in the admiration of an enlightened people? Surely, the applauses of millions and the encouragement held out by their taste and munificence furnish sufficient stimulatives, as they afford sufficient rewards for the highest exertions of genius. Such patrons require no degrading sacrifices of independence and exact no servility. Instead of looking down with proud superiority on the man who administers to their pleasure and improvement, they contemplate him with affectionate reverence and reward him by every demonstration of gratitude in their power. While Florence was free, the distinguished literary men of that illustrious commonwealth were honored with the highest offices. The Secretary of State was almost always a scholar of eminence, and a great portion of her embassies were confided to that class of men. The states of Holland, when enjoying their greatest degree of freedom, pursued the same policy with regard to Grotius and other distinguished writers, and Rubens was charged with more than one important embassy by these famous republics. Compare the sums of money received by the distinguished writers and artists of the present age in England with the rewards of those who enjoyed the patronage of kings, princes, and nobility. The former had no patrons but a liberal and enlightened public, through whose munificence they received a far more liberal remuneration, independent of the degradation of individual patronage, than any king of England, France, or Spain, or any prince or pope of Italy ever bestowed. In illustration of this, it is only necessary to cite the examples of Walter Scott, Lord Byron, Mr. Moore, and many minor names, who received their thousands for single works, certainly not superior to those of Dante and Tasso, both in turn the objects and victims of princely patronage and oppression. On the other hand, let us turn to the long and dismal array of names which, in the days of royal and noble patronage, lived a life of poverty and perished in despair. To cite them would fill a volume and savor of the records of a parish poorhouse. But since the period when genius became emancipated from all other patronage but that of an enlightened public, we hear no more of its perishing for want, or pining in hopeless obscurity. Poverty is no more its reproach or opprobrium, and the old joke of living in garrets is no longer applicable. The voice of their countrymen calls them forth from oblivion. Its munificence rewards their exertions, and men of unquestionable talents in literature and the arts are only required to exercise that degree of industry and prudence which is necessary in all other pursuits of life to attain to competency if not wealth. With regard to the fine arts, the result is the same. It is true that Van Dyck was invited over to England by King Charles and knighted when knighthood was the jest of the poets and dramatic writers. But it is now known, from documents lately brought to light, that he was obliged to paint portraits for the king at a less price than he received from others. Our countryman West also tasted the sweets of royal patronage and spent a good portion of his life in painting pictures for which he was never paid. We should never have done, were we to undertake to cite all the examples of royal and princely patronage. They will most of them readily occur to the general reader, and such is their numbers and celebrity that their united weight is sufficient to overwhelm all the empty boasts of the munificence of kings, princes, and nobility. Turning our eyes toward our own free country, which labors under the ban of aristocracy, and is considered little better than a barren waste, in which neither literature nor the arts can find either soil or sustenance, there is nothing which indicates that she will not in good time attain to eminence in both, without paying for them more than they are worth, in the sacrifice of liberty. If we do not err, she is destined in good time to vindicate them from the foul slander of being the groveling satellites of corruption, the abject followers and dependents of despotism. It is in the rich soil of rational freedom, which, while it gives scope and license to all the vigorous efforts of genius, at the same time affords peace and security, as well as rewards to its exertions, that all the higher qualities have attained their greatest perfection. It is there that genius and virtue find their most appropriate home and their noblest field of exercise, because they have nothing to hope from base prostitution and nothing to fear from jealous despotism. We hear it every day confidently asserted, as if it were a fact challenging denial, that the rewards bestowed on literature and the fine arts in the United States have not equaled those they received in Italy and other countries of Europe. We deny this, and appeal to the proof in the examples already brought forward. Did we ever hear of any respectable artist in the United States being rewarded by a sack of corn for a first-rate picture? Is there an instance of one perishing like the inimitable Correggio from carrying the price of a picture and copper coin on his shoulders? or admitting there is one capable of producing a picture equal to the street Jerome of Domenichino, would he find, in the wide circuit of these United States, a gentleman who would debase himself by offering such a price as the Italian artist received? On the contrary, we know that Colonel Trumbull received $8,000 apiece from the Congress of the United States for 4 pictures, neither of them certainly equal to the Communion of Street Jerome, the Flight into Egypt, or the Assumption of the Virgin. We know, too, that the same distinguished body has lately voted a similar sum for a similar number of pictures of native artists to be placed in the rotunda of the Capitol for the contemplation of future ages. And we also know that a company of gentlemen in Boston has contracted with Mr. Washington Alston for a picture, for which he is to receive $10,000 if it is ever finished, of which we believe there is some doubt. Other instances might be adduced of American artists making $4,000, $6,000, and even $12,000 a year. We put the question to those who assail our institutions and government on this ground, whether they know of any potentate of Europe who, within the same period, has offered such inducements to living artists? No. They give enormous prices for the works of dead artists, and leave the living ones to take their chance with the public. Our artists need no longer go abroad to earn a livelihood or gain a name. Those who have talents and industry meet with employment and liberal compensation. They receive quite as much, and sometimes a great deal more, than is given for similar productions in Europe. They also receive equal, if not greater attention, and their society is courted by the first people in the land. We know that distinguished sculptor and most amiable, intelligent gentleman, Mr. Horatio Greenough, whom his country delights, and ought to delight, to honor, when he left this city, a few days since, carried with him engagements to the amount of $17,000, and that others to a large amount have since been forwarded to him. We also know that he has ascertained there is a sufficiency of marble in this country, superior for all purposes of statuary to that of Carrara, and that when he has finished his statue of Washington, he means to come home and devote himself to the establishment of a school of statuary. We shall then see whether it requires the patronage of kings, the distinctions of ranks, the monopoly of wealth, and the sacrifice of liberty to make the arts flourish in our great republic. Our literary men and artists need no longer go abroad, we again repeat, to earn a livelihood or gain a reputation. The period is fast approaching when they will address themselves to 50, and by 100 millions of their countrymen, all speaking the same language, all advancing abreast with equal steps, and forming a solid phalanx of mind and purpose, such as the world never saw before. Is there not here a sphere adequate to the most vaulting ambition? And why, therefore, should they look abroad for the stinted praise of foreign hireling critics, when they can implant their names deep in the soil of a country wider than any homogeneous empire that the world ever saw, and where they will live in ages to come, when peradventure the fate of Europe may follow that of the other quarters of the old world? Let them appeal to the feelings and pride of this great and growing nation instead of those of foreigners, and consecrate their genius at the shrine of patriotism. Let them strike the right chord, and if it does not promptly respond to the touch, then let them complain, and let the imputation we have been contesting be acknowledged as the truth. Then let them repeat the old sing-song about the incompatibility of freedom with the perfection of the arts, and the necessity of patronage, servitude and degradation to a Michelangelo, a Raphael, a Correggio, a Claude, a Titian, a Canova, a Thorwaldsen, or a Greenough, until they have made this trial, silence, study, effort, and industry would better become them than complaint and despondency. Let them read the lives of these illustrious artists, whose fame now illuminates the civilized world, and learn by what a succession of labors, anxieties, disappointments, and mortifications they at length gain the summit of their art. They will then see that the highest rewards are only the meed of the greatest efforts, and that the exertions of a whole life are necessary to live hereafter. Let them also recollect that all the artists of Italy are not equally celebrated. The names of thousands and tens of thousands, during the period in which the arts flourished in that country in their greatest splendor, now rest in the repose of oblivion, or are only recorded in dictionaries. Thousands and tens of thousands have also attained but a small portion of the fame of these illustrious masters, who, though nearly contemporary with each other, seem to have been the product of centuries. Ages preceded and succeeded them, without producing their equals, and who knows but that in which the old world has failed may be achieved by the new. Without doubt, many a bright genius of whom the world has never heard, during the age of these great masters, pined away in neglect and obscurity, notwithstanding the patronage of kings and nobility, and what is more, in spite of that of the illustrious merchants and mechanics of Florence. A still greater number of artists, without genius or industry, were left to combat with their own imbecility, and, we dare say, were loud in their complaints of the neglect of their countrymen. It is the lot of mediocrity and inferiority to complain, and it is equally so for men of the highest genius to meet with disappointments in their pursuits. In the great game of human life, few win and many lose, nor is the race always to the swift, or the battle to the strong. If, then, it should happen, as it most undoubtedly will, that among the present or any future race of artists who start in the great sweepstakes for fame and fortune, some, nay, very many, should break down, some give out, and some be distanced, while but a few arrive at the goal, let them not, in a spirit of querulous complaint, lay their failure at the door of our free institutions. Let them refrain from joining the hue and cry that the fine arts are incompatible with the general diffusion of rights, property, and intelligence, and that to have fine pictures and statues, men must once more become slaves. If such indeed be the case, then we say, let us dispense with saints and Madonnas, Venuses and Apollos, and cling to the goddess of liberty. If it must be so, let us sacrifice the arts to freedom, remembering that in the language of the poet Lucan, libertas ultima mundi quo, steterit ferienda loco.